One of my favorite stories is about Buckminster Fuller. If you haven't heard of Bucky Fuller, it's one of those things that's worth Googling. This guy was crazy. He was an inventor. He was a futurist. He was one of those guys that just was always thinking differently. And if you look at his epitaph, it says very simply, "Call me trimtab." One of the most unique things I've ever seen. So anybody here have a boat, you know what a trimtab is. If you've been in a plane, you know what a trimtab is. It's that very small rudder located on the bigger rudder. And where that story came from was he was watching the Queen Mary, which is a huge, monstrous ship, navigate effortlessly with this little guy there. So he's this monster ship and a rudder. Now on that monster rudder, there's no way any of us are strong enough to move that rudder back and forth, but there's a small rudder located specifically on a very important part. You can't just put it anywhere. It's got to be strategically on that right part. And if you move it, it takes almost no effort at all. But that rudder moves, and all of a sudden the big rudder follows. And if the big rudder moves, the entire ship moves. I think it becomes an analogy for understanding your life, your business plan, the strategies. And what I'm going to be talking about today is identifying some of those trim tabs for your business. Some of those things that don't require you to move heaven and earth to get to where you need to go. But those things that through science, so understanding how the brain, which we're going to be talking about today, that if you just make those little adjustments, all of a sudden big things start happening. And so when we look at the concept of this, is where, if you look at results, I think we'd all agree that results is what either we get or we try to get. And sometimes we like the results that we get. Sometimes we don't like the results that we get. Sometimes we look in the mirror, we're like, man, this is good. The workout's been paying off. Diet's been good. Sometimes we look in the mirror, we're like, man, this isn't good. So we have results. Sometimes they're good, sometimes they're bad. Every single client I work with, first thing we talk about, they say, here's what we want you to do, Rene. I say, great, I understand what you want me to do, but let me ask you this. What are you trying to get out of this? Some clients are good at answering that question. Some loan officers, they're good at answering that question. Some don't know. And it's hard. I know what we can do, but what's the purpose? Why are we doing it? What result are we trying to get at? And so when we look at this concept, we know that results are driven by behavior, right? And when we look at behavior, we know that if we want to change our results, what has to change first? Our behavior and our actions that we take. Now, so typical approaches to change, when we look at it, approach change from a behavioral perspective. Now, how many of you like to be changed, or how many of you like to engage in change? The reality is none of us do. We hate it, right? Exactly. You like it? Okay. I always say the person who likes it, Liz is one of those anomalies, all right? But the reality is that you've gotten comfortable in change. You've gotten almost like your change muscles sort of good to go. But there are certain changes, I bet you, if we talked for long enough, we'd figure out that those kind of changes you don't want to make. So change, the resistance to change is actually a good thing. It's biologically ingrained in us through the process of homeostasis. And especially over time, we realize that it's easier to do things this way versus that way. And so let's just stay this way. And somebody tries to change course, and the stress level gets too high. So we know that change, when it's approached at this behavioral level, just leads to resistance. And so when we resist, this is why results are so hard to get. This is why 9 out of 10 companies fail to execute on strategy. This is why most loan officers aren't all that successful. This is why most salespeople aren't successful, because the behavior that requires them to get the results that they want is usually a change. Every single time I've been brought in an organization to do sales training, it's about change. How do we change behavior? And guess what? Those changes, they're not new. Usually it requires picking up the phone, making a few more phone calls. Usually it requires making and setting more appointments, saying no to certain distractions, saying yes to things that maybe we didn't want to do. And so when we look at this, we know this to be true. My approach, what I've always looked at is I said, let's look at what drives behavior. What is it, the thing that drives behavior? And usually that's the thing that nobody wants to look at. And that's what we're here to talk about today. It's beliefs. This is what drives behavior. If I can affect you in this concept, in this area of what you believe, this becomes a very natural follow. I don't have to put any effort. This here is the trim tab of your behavior. And if your behavior happens, guess what? Results automatically happen. And so I want you to kind of think about this here. And now the challenge when we talk about beliefs, it's not one of those things that hey, I'm going to challenge your beliefs. I'm not going to challenge your beliefs. I'm going to prove things to you today. Okay? And I want you to learn this, because today we're here to talk about influence. And so there's 2 things that are going to be happening. One is I'm going to be talking to you about concepts around influence and presentation. But I'm also going to be demonstrating right now, I've already begun, the same concepts of presentation. So you have a couple tasks today. Number one is to be a student and to learn and to absorb as much as you can. But I want you to be more of a student of your own experience today. I think the most powerful salespeople are the ones that are the most astute to how they feel when they're being sold. When that moment comes, they go, yeah, you know, I don't want to buy something. I have no interest in that moment. They say, the salesperson says something, you go, I didn't know I could do that. And that feeling that you get from the transference of like, I have no interest to, oh my gosh, you can do that. And if you can remember what it feels like for you to go through that, and you remember what you said and what they said, then you can take that same experience, that same language, that same sequence, and transition it into your language so that you can create it. And if you can remember what it's like to, when you felt it that way, and you look in the realtor's eyes, you look in the client's eyes, you look in the referral partner's eyes, and you see them light up the same way you did, guess what? You know that you're on track at that point. So I want you to be students of your own experience as I walk you through some of these concepts.